pentagram dedicated to Henry Foreman. In the years of the primal force and the dawn of terrestrial birth, man mastered the mammoth and horse, and man was the lord of the earth. He made him an hollow skin from the heart of an holy tree. He compassed the earth.
Good morning, Vietnam. Well, at least according to the internal statistics of my Spotify podcast algorithm, or whatever you want to call it. Yes, I've said the word algorithm already. It states clearly that I have more than one listener in Vietnam. So if you're in Vietnam, well, hello to you, and hello to the rest of you. I'm Alan Averill. This is Agitators Anonymous, episode 129. If you want to support the show, you can do it over at patreon.com/Alan Averill. All sorts of interesting things, demos, conversations, extra bonus podcasts, that kind of thing. The show is sponsored by metalblade.com in North America, which includes that Canada. You can get 10% off your order if you use the promo code ALAN, and various other things and new sponsors on the way. All that kind of thing. There's going to be a few links underneath the description. You can follow them if you wish. I had a couple of things I was going to talk about today. Some of you were asking me, where has the Tuesday episode gone? Well, I kind of felt like maybe I'd overdone the arsenic. They say that if you take a little bit of arsenic every day, you can develop an immunity. But I kind of felt maybe two, shall we say, matches, two boxing matches going. Maybe a couple less rounds on the Tuesday with me was maybe becoming a bit too much. So I took a little bit of a step off the pedal for that one, you know, pedal to the metal, never ever false metal, etc. If you can tell me what album that quote is from or what song that lyric is from, you might win a prize. And that prize might just be just the simple glory of knowing something that maybe probably not many other people would recognize in this podcast. Anyway, what the hell am I talking about? I was a couple of things I was going to talk about today. One was some stuff about Jordan Peterson, but then I went, he's a bit annoying lately, and probably that podcast would just be a bit annoying. Then there was a brilliant quote from Louis C.K., one of my favorite comedians. And I might get to that in another podcast because what he said was kind of like blew my mind a little bit. And maybe I'll mention it at the end and you can see if it blows your mind as well. But maybe we'll leave that for next week. And what I'm going to do is, first off, by way of a little bit of housekeeping, is say that tomorrow night Primordial plays in Bucharest in Romania. And with all sorts of great bands like Dodorech and Varathron and all that kind of thing. And on Saturday we play in Sofia in Bulgaria. So if you are around in either of those places and somehow are not aware of that, well then, get yourself down there. The following week, Primordial plays in Rennes, and that is the 21st and 22nd with all sorts of bands like Fen and Aggressor. And it's a double header. We're playing 2 nights and 2 different sets. So if you're in the northwest of France and want to head over to Rennes, well, yeah, you can figure out the details. And the following weekend, the heavy Hamburg Halloween special is going to be something really cool. We're playing with Night Demon, Portrait, Witch Hazel, Psycho Punch, etc., etc. It's in the Markthal in Hamburg, and tickets are still available. That is on the 28th. But seeing as, in a very kind of strange turn of events, this weekend we're playing, I'm not quite a complete parallel, but 22 years ago, Primordial went to play in Bulgaria and Romania. And so what I'm going to do is going to make this podcast a little bit of a reminisce, a little bit of a nostalgia, a look back at that experience. I don't think I've talked about it on the podcast before. It was a pretty crazy experience and really pretty fascinating. And I'm going to talk about that and the differences between now and then, and how it all looked to a bunch of 5 reprobates from Ireland when they arrived in that Bulgaria and that Romania. And so this podcast is just going to be a little bit of a look back at that and how I think that maybe the countries have changed and how, I mean, more specifically, well, there's many things that are specific about this whole, the context of this podcast, but Eastern Europe was still a kind of mystery. I mean, in 2000, I think, when we went to play, it was either 2000 or 2001, we went to play. We were a replacement, I'm not sure for whom. The rumour is it was Satyricon, but I can't have been correct, because Satyricon, I think, were far too big. But the gigs were organised by Negru from Negur Bunjit. Rest in peace or rest in power, however they say it. A band who I suppose we had felt we had some kind of spiritual links to in relation to being one of the OGs, one of the originals of that sort of early 90s pagan black metal scene, or at least black metal bands that were adopting elements of their own culture, of their own history, of their own folklore into the music, which we were doing with Imrama in 93, 94. And, we were all doing it in a little bit of a different way. But there was certainly a group of bands who were, let's say, on the periphery of the black metal scene. Not orthodox black metal, I would never say that, but they certainly were part of it, but had a little, kind of sidestepped into the shadow a little bit. And that shadow was, as I said, a sort of reverence for your own culture, mythology, history, and all that kind of stuff. So Nagura Bunjit were kind of like kindred spirits in some way that we had not met before. And it's quite incredible because people don't really realize that sort of Ryanair broke that nut open, or whatever you want to say, cracked that nut. And that they broke the stranglehold that the old airlines had on air travel, which I think is starting to happen again at the moment. But to fly somewhere like in Eastern Europe, even in 2000, because don't forget, that's only 10 years really from the fall of communism. And now we're 22 years from 2000, of course. People still say to me, "Oh, have you heard that album from 2002?" And I go, "No, I don't like any of the new Creator albums," etc., etc. You know exactly what I mean when I say that. But the cost of flying us there from to go from Dublin to Sofia in 2000, and when you looked at the map, I'd travelled to Greece and a few other places, but Sofia just seemed very exotic, very different for us. And it really was quite new and quite interesting, quite strange. And I think even in the 1990s, a couple of bands had played in Romania. Anathema, if I'm not incorrect, had played some very big gigs in Romania in the 90s. But still, Romania was kind of like, it was an undiscovered country when it comes to metal. And we weren't even playing in Bucharest. We were playing in Timișoara, which is where actually the revolution, as I understood it, began. And, memories of Romania in our heads really, and this is before, as I said, Ryanair had sort of cracked the nut, and that we'd met people in Dublin, of course, in the 2000s who had emigrated from Romania to Ireland to try and earn some money. The Celtic Tiger was booming. Ireland was doing very well. And, lots of people from Eastern Europe were coming into Ireland. We met many great people from Romania at this time. Who'd come over to Ireland. And then, of course, there were lots of misconceptions about people from those countries, which we were happy to confound and learn and discover ourselves by visiting these countries, what amazing places they were. It should go without saying. But, we had watched the trial and execution of Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu on the TV. I mean, don't forget they were literally court-martialed, and the main charge as genocide of murdering, I think, over 60,000 people. And the revolutions had started in Timișoara, and there we were. The cold breath of history, and I mean that quite literally, as it was freezing cold when we were playing in Timișoara, had its icy hand on your shoulder as you walk the streets of Timișoara. And those kind of things were very important to your early steps. I was always very fascinated by going to a new country, and Bulgaria and Romania in those moments seemed very, very otherworldly. Not many bands had played yet in Romania. Certainly, I would say we must have been one of the first foreign bands to come and play, as countries take a while to catch up once the wall comes down and foreign bands are able to go over and play. No, I can't lay claim to playing in those places in the 90s, but certainly in the early 2000s it was still quite fresh. And like I said, the revolution, for example, in Romania, we'd watched it on the TV. We'd watched the odious Nicolae and Elena being shot on a rooftop as they, if I'm not incorrect, as they tried to escape on a helicopter. Or maybe I'm mixing those two things up. Probably. There'll be some things in this story that are mixed up, because don't forget, it's 22 years ago, and I am a man of advancing years, and I'm not always in full control of my all of my mental capacities. I know that sounds difficult to believe, but so we landed in Sofia, and we played in 2000, and it was my memories of that are I have many memories of that, and we'll try and go through them and put together a podcast. But we played in some sort of It was like a basketball hall, which led me to believe that it surely couldn't have been made for us, because I guess there were 300 or 400 people there, maybe, but the whole space was way too big. We'd heard that maybe Sodom had played there, and I think not many other bands, but the idea that we would somehow be able to fill that space was, was a little bit of a pipe dream as far as the organisers were concerned. But there we were, sitting in this small empty room in the backstage in the bowels of some of this, what was like a kind of small basketball hall, with people outside in the kind of courtyard smashing shit up, breaking stuff up, as we were told sort of angrily by, there was a lot of security around back then, and which made you always wonder, whenever you go into a venue in a country that has like 10, 15, 20 security guards, you're kind of thinking to yourself, okay, there's something strange is happening. Somebody's on the make here. There's some sort of mafia type thing rolling along the corridors. But got this knock on the door, and we'd been, kind of like observing the chaos outside as people who were unable to afford the 4 or 5 euro, whatever it was, to come in and see us, were busy smashing stuff. People were outside drinking vodka. I mean, look, this is the cliche that goes, but sure enough, there we were looking out the window, handing bottles of vodka in and out the window to people, hanging out, talking to people in the crowd, trying to figure out a way of trying to get people in who couldn't afford it, etc., etc. The humanitarian Irish, as we are well known as part of our cliche, of course. But there's a knock on the door, and this big fat butcher with a bloody apron was standing at the door, and he says, "You looking for blood?" And I had sort of said in a kind of pithy kind of way, "Oh, I wouldn't mind some blood, we're pretty black metal, maybe we'd get some blood." Little did I realise an actual butcher would knock on the door with a huge big plastic bottle of warm animal blood, which was one of the most, like, if you can imagine Destruction, the Mad Butcher 12-inch, that's kind of what it was like. This huge dude who'd obviously just walked from the butcher across and handed me a warm vial of indeterminate animal blood, which you can find, I think I sort of kind of daubed on my face and my arms a little bit. I don't think I didn't do a full Impale Nazarene 1994 with it, or a full G.G. Allen with it, or whatever. I think even I was a little bit too shocked to kind of do that. And I do remember the van being searched, but I'll get into that. But one of the cops pulling out this warm bottle of blood later that evening, or this bottle of blood the next day, going, "What the fuck is this?" Because there was kind of lots of questions that were coming into the organisers. I'm kind of skipping ahead of myself, but the idea that were these guys Satanists? Were these guys devil worshippers? And then, of course, you find a big bottle of animal blood in the back of the van. But anyway, I digress. And it was just a very strange, unusual feeling. But definitely, as somebody who's an avid student of history and a reader of books and really fascinated by the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of communism and all that kind of stuff, the idea that here we were, and it wasn't that far removed, 9-10 years. Now, of course, the leader of Bulgaria was a Todor Hristov Zhivkov, who was I'm looking at Wikipedia here because I hadn't known a lot about him. Bulgarian communist statesman, served as de facto leader of the People's Republic of Bulgaria from 1954 until 1989, and that's when he resigned. He remained in the position for 35 years. Now, the reason you probably don't know his name is because it would, by all accounts, and people can correct me in the comments, and I'm sure I'll meet some people who will correct me, by all accounts, his rule was not as bloody and iron-fisted as many others in the region. There are many other names, whether it's Tito himself or many other rulers from that era who have a much more fearsome reputation. But the Bulgarian communist rule seems to have gone more quietly into the night, shall we say, than Ceausescu. And if anybody's been to Bucharest and seen the palace that Ceausescu's built for themselves, which is like literally, it's one of the most ostentatious, insane buildings you've ever seen in your entire life. And how people in the poorest areas of Bucharest must have thought when they cycled by or whatever, or driven by in their Trabants, and seen this incredible building as, this sort of opulent, supremely decadent symbol of wealth, while their country, laboured under such poverty. The mind boggles if you're in Bucharest, which is a beautiful city, by the way, and one of the most fascinating cities in that it has incredibly old buildings which are sort of bookended right up to these old communist tower blocks, which is a little bit different to some other Eastern Bloc capitals, with this sort of kind of faded glory that I really, really love. Yeah, I was a fan, a really avid historian, and so curious about all these countries. You wanted to walk every street that you got to, and I still feel the same way, thankfully. My like I said, I'm doing this podcast before going to get the plane and fly to Bucharest, and my appetite for trying to walk along a street I haven't yet hasn't faded that much, although it depends on how much sleep I've got. Anyway, that's another story. But there we played in Sofia, and then afterwards went to some bar where there's a strange custom of having the band sit in the middle of the bar under bright lights and give us free food. I'm not a man who likes eating in public, as anybody who knows me will know this. I'm not a man who likes dining al fresco, not my style, I'm afraid. And how we all quietly and uncomfortably shifted and disappeared off into the dark shadows of the pub, because everybody was just standing around looking at us, which was kind of uncomfortable, at least as I remember it. Like I said before on the podcast, Irish people look best in the dark. And that was the same then as it is now. And the whole experience was kind of surreal. Of course, Nagur Bunjit there, who we made friends with over the years. And the idea that, tomorrow we'll play with Dordrecht, who are the sort of descendants of half of that band from back then. It's still something special to meet all the old faces and exchange, the nods and the looks of like, all right, when somebody else has been in the trenches for 25 or 30 years and are still going and haven't quite given in to the passing of time or the embracing of apathy instead of making music. It's still quite an amazing thing. However, anyway, so there we are walking around the streets of Sofia. I remember going to some bootleg CD stall in the street and being, like, oh my God, they have an Interglory ride. Hail to England, double disc, etc., etc. Now, of course, I would be searching for vinyls, but back then, just the idea that you could just buy all these bootleg CDs, and sure enough, pretty sure we found a bootleg Primordial CD of the first two albums in Ram and Journey's End, which I have somewhere, which I was pretty fascinated by. Or there were cassette versions of Journey's End and that kind of thing, which was just so cool to be able to find them on the street somewhere. But just also so I guess a sort of exotic quality of going somewhere where the alphabet on ads was different, that kind of stuff. Anyway, so we played our gig in Sofia. If you can remember some of the other bands that played, you should let me know in the comments. My memory is a bit hazy on that. But there we were, packed up the van, disappeared to some pub where we all kind of disappeared out of the limelight in the middle of it, which was never really something I think we were particularly comfortable with. And the next morning, arriving down to the little van in Sofia, this is kind of where the story gets, I think, quite, in turns hilarious and in turns really kind of quite dark. I arrived in the van to find Negru and Kieran discussing the difference in farming methods between Romania and Ireland. I mean, super exciting conversation, riveting rock and roll stories. Nope, it was just agrarian cultural movements within those two countries. And we were in this little van and we had this sort of... no word of a lie, we had this amazing driver who'd shown up in a suit, in a kind of a bit like, I'm going to say Borat, I suppose, because the first thing that comes to mind for most Western people, but a Borat style suit with a mustache and sort of curly hair, and he was very friendly guy, didn't really speak much English, but okay, and he was dressed up in his suit to drive us from Sofia to Timișoara. And on that journey, you have to go through the corner of Belgrade. At least you should go through the corner of Serbia. And what you have to do very often in some of these countries is you go through two border checkpoints in a row. So like if you're going from Turkey, for example, into Bulgaria, driving across, you stop at the Turkish side, and then you've got a kind of little no man's land, and then the Bulgarian side. It can take literally hours, and especially if what happened in those days is that they would stop a van with a bunch of bands and grill them for hours, and they would take out every instrument, which they did on the Serbian border. and put it all on the ground in the baking sun and ask for, I suppose it would be the equivalent of what's called a carnet or carnet, which is a list of your equipment. Of course, we didn't know. You realise you had to have. And they wanted to know the value of every single instrument. And we, of course, thought, being Irish, like, okay, so they're pegging everything and they're going to, somebody's going to head us off at the next, maybe like 2 kilometres away and rob us because they've rang ahead to say, yeah, bunch of lads coming up with a few guitars. Yeah, perfect. Rob them at the next petrol station, etc., etc. That's just kind of, if you've grown up in Ireland, that's kind of what you think about things. So we weren't like how we say, we weren't sort of green Swedes, as you might say. We were quite, because we'd grown up in a country that had been a little bit hairy, had been poor, had been a little bit dicey on the streets every now and again. We were wise, or at least to some of the things that were going on, but we still weren't ready for armed military at the border. And our Borat driver, great dude, he had one cassette, and that was Laundry Service by Shakira. You're one from Colombia. My breasts are small and humble, or whatever it is. And all he did was just play the same cassette over and over and over again. So the rather surreal view of watching him remonstrating with border guards, replete with guns and all that kind of stuff, while Laundry Service just played over and over and over again in the background, was pretty fucking surreal, to say the least. But what happened then is something really, really pretty crazy, which I guess is a really particular example of how things can be in that area of the world. But the Serbian border guards, as I remember, and now somebody may correct me in the comments, I'm not sure who that would be, but I've looked at the map to make sure this corroborates my story, and I can see that this does make sense. There was a deal struck. They were not going to let us through, except with the exception of that we bring 3 soldiers with us to Belgrade. You can, if you look on the map, you can see that you would drive to Belgrade and then across into Timisoara. They're pretty near. And our Borat driver and our tour manager of the time didn't really have a choice, because they weren't going to let us through, and they were just going to keep us there for hours and hours and hours. And I wasn't really paying attention when I was sort of like looking out the window, blah, blah, blah. And the next thing I noticed was a dude just sit beside me in fatigues, in like camouflage. And he had his hand, they had guns with them, and just sat down beside me. And I could just see tattoos on his wrist, sort of right-wing tattoos. I suppose that's the cliche, unfortunately, of, people in the Serbian military. Nevertheless, it's my story. Tell your own story. And I still had long hair at the time, and I was just sitting there, and the whole rest of the band had disappeared down the back of this little van. So I got to sit beside these 2 guys in silence, literally while the dude held his gun, which was sort of right, kind of like a little bit too close to my face. And he just says, "Oh, where are you from?" Ireland. Oh, they don't know. People don't know that much about Ireland until you say IRA. IRA, okay. This is the IRA in Ireland, and republicanism and nationalism. The Irish are always viewed as the underdogs, and we haven't really fucked anyone over or oppressed anyone. But these soldiers, it took a long time for that to thaw. They were basically like, American, English, and we're like, no. And then a guy called me, "You are a hippie band," and we're like, no, we're not a hippie band, because we had still had long hair, and these dudes were really not having it.com. And we got out somewhere in some sort of like ruined kind of, as my memory is a bit hazy with this, but some sort of slightly ruined, how can we say, the kind of edge of some town. And they were like, "Look, bombed by United Nations, bombed by you guys." And I was like, well, this is not us. We are not those guys. We're from Ireland. And this is before mobile phones where you could show somebody a map or anything like this. And you don't want to kind of pull out your passport for somebody to walk off with your passport, which can happen. It happened to me in Transnistria, the self-declared communist republic between Moldova and Ukraine. Dudes just walked off with my passport with machine guns, and you have to stand there like an idiot until someone eventually comes over and goes, "Where the fuck are you from? What are you from?" And you go, "Ireland." And they go, "Oh, okay." They don't have a problem with the Irish. And eventually we managed to get through to these guys, but they were like, "Bombed by United Nations, this is on you." And like, "Nah, not quite. No, we're not American," etc. George Bush Tony Blair. Actually, well, not George Bush. It would have been Clinton, wouldn't it? Yeah, so there was this big tension. We had to drive these three guys. Eventually, we sort of made some kind of peace with them. I think it was when they realized that we weren't hippies, but I don't think we could quite explain to them what black metal or pagan metal was. But either way, we made enough friends that they were like, "Oh, you will play tonight in Belgrade," and we were like, "No, well, no, not really." But and like, "Okay, where is the venue?" Couldn't quite explain that we were going there, and then on to another place. We will come down, bring whole of brigade down, etc., etc. And we sort of bluffed and huffed and puffed and made excuses and. Sort of when we got to Belgrade, sort of these three guys got off the van, and we'd done our sort of duty, so to speak. They gave us a little salute, and off they went into their wherever they were going, and we were allowed to continue our journey to kind of like northeast, just across the border to Timisoara again. But it gave us all a very great and clear insight, and because when I look at the map now, I presume we would have driven through what is now as part of the self-declared Republic of Kosovo. I just met a man at a border crossing going from Turkey to Bulgaria, a Kosovan soldier who just happened to be standing in front of me in the queue, and we had a big chat about Kosovo and Kosovan independence for about an hour. And like many people from that region, they're just fascinated that and really happy that you know a little bit about their history. And he rooted around his bag and gave me a gift of a bracelet, which I thought was a very kind of touching move. And of course, always the hospitality of, I think this is ubiquitous in that region of, if you come to region, you come to my house and blah, blah, and you exchange your phone number and he's ringing your phone. Okay, you have my number. Very, very, this is a really big thing in that area, and something I recognize as something similar in Ireland. Note to all Germans, if an Irish person invites you to come and stay in their house, they don't really mean it. Anyway, so we make our way through kind of like the edge of Serbia with three soldiers in the van. There's mountains. The landscape is beautiful. We stop off in a petrol station which seems to only house three-legged dogs, I guess, if you like. Dogs, you don't eat them all at one at a time. I don't know, but there was lots of three-legged dogs there. We collected another band on the way. I think the Stone from somewhere who are still going, and they played with us at the gig in Timisoara. And an entire crazy day with enough things within that day to take up probably a whole chapter in a book. Write the book. Absolutely crazy day. And we all got there to Timisoara, and I was there like, well, this is where the revolution started against Ceausescu, where tens of thousands of people came out on the street, even more, and the whole thing began to collapse, the weight of the fall of communism. And it happened here. And if you've ever never not seen Elena and Nikolai being shot, at at the end of their trial, or parts of their trial, you should watch that. There's also a 4-part documentary called The Fall of Yugoslavia, which is really, really fascinating. BBC documentary from the 90s, which has access to all of the main perpetrators, all of the main movers and shakers and tyrants, and it's absolutely fascinating and absolutely brilliant. I would recommend that. I might put the link under it somewhere. And sure enough, we arrive in Timisoara, which is a kind of fascinating place, but it was really cold and really gloomy. And there were a lot of security at the gig, again, trying to keep people out. They wouldn't play music between the bands, and it was just kind of like this icy silence. Somebody somewhere has a video of us playing. If you have it, please send it to me. I'd like to see it. And we were just in the bowels again of this really strange old, I think in my head I had it as like a communist meeting hall with all different high balconies and all these kind of levels looking down on the stage. Maybe, I don't know, 200 people there or something like this. But I just remember being icy cold, really, really cold. And after the gig, we're talking with Negru about it had been a really strange. Now after that we'd done long tours before, but we hadn't quite come this far east, and being really disappointed that somebody had gone off to buy something to eat and come back with a bag of McDonald's for everybody, and we were like, oh, what we wanted to eat something local, and this strange sight of this kind of dilapidated old backstage room with all this kind of still iconography and symbolism of a dictatorship still kind of like everywhere, and then this bag of like cold McDonald's stuff just sitting on the table somehow seemed to be striking. Maybe my young self was reading a little bit more into these things symbolically than maybe my middle-aged self would have done. But Timișoara has a very important place in Romanian history, and I think in the overall context of the public and their right to protest, which we've seen, being attacked for the last couple of years, lots of new laws to stop protest, etc. The idea that the people should, can come together to basically oust such a tyrant as Ceausescu is quite incredible. And maybe if you don't know much about Romanian history, go and take a look. Of course, in the years that have passed, the 20 odd years have passed since those two gigs, I've seen both countries develop a lot. I was in both of those countries in the last year or two. And you can certainly see the elements of a technological progression, especially in Bucharest. I love the building around Bucharest. I suppose it's what Western people would balk at and being called gentrification, but for countries like that, the development of infrastructure creates opportunity and holds those countries level with, or more level with their Western counterparts. And it's essential to, I think, the economic growth of a country. And for anybody who's considering whether they should go and visit those countries, definitely. Romania, especially the eastern side, up in Transylvania, staggeringly beautiful, wild kind of place and full of incredible history. It's got, I think, all the myths about the Dracula's kind of stuff. Super worth exploring, all of the castles and all, as I said, Transylvania. Bulgaria is fascinating as well. I was only in Plovdiv and went to an amphitheatre to see Solstafir play, and Plovdiv has all of this Roman history, like an ancient Roman town. There's so much history in all of these areas that is super worth exploring. But even the grim Eastern European kind of architecture, the brutalist architecture, I find fascinating, and the sort of decaying sense of an empire that once ruled over those countries, even only 20, 30 years ago, I find really interesting, even if it can be a little bit depressing. But those countries have been kind of opened to the world. The idea in 2000 that you could go and visit Moldova, which I have ended up now being in 3 different times, was incredible. That you would meet a Moldovan working in a bar, for example. I think sadly Moldova have lost almost half of their population once their borders were opened. And so now there's literally just old people and very young people. It's quite a sad story. I watched a few documentaries about it, and you can see it when you visit there if you drive through it then in the small towns. Anyway, that's a podcast for another day, I guess. Those small countries, many of their infrastructure was held together, I suppose, by the old communist infrastructure that never quite got replaced or updated, or the movement, the technological movement that was going to come and supplant that old order, just left some places behind. I guess that's a complex paradox, which maybe I should explore in another podcast. But it's with great sort of joy, I think, that in the last 20, 25 years, and especially for somewhere like Ryanair, I keep always espousing the virtues of Ryanair. But the idea that, like, you could probably get a Ryanair flight from, like, Dublin to, a Burgas or something, by the Black Sea in Bulgaria, off season, Tuesday to Wednesday, for cheaper than it probably is to get on the train from Dublin to Cork. And all of these places were opened to the world, open to be discovered, and to have incredible histories, and also to understand not just the incredible things from history, but to be able to understand the great pain and hardship, and try and have some form of understanding of where these countries have come from in escaping tyranny and authoritarianism. Because, like I would say, for many of these countries, the Second World War didn't quite end when it ended, because all of those countries were just handed to Stalin and the Iron Curtain created, and the authoritarian rule. Some of Western Europe was rebuilt, etc. There was a different set of problems, but one thing that was important in the West was a sense of freedom and liberty. Yeah, you can scoff at that. That's true. And there are many people, I think now on, let's call it whatever, the kind of elements of the new left who espouse virtues of communism or whatever you want to say, but I think it's a kind of like picture book communism. I think it's champagne socialism. Because if they've ever went and asked a Romanian who was in their 50s or 60s and said, well, how was Ceausescu for you? Was it champagne socialism? I think you'd get a very, very different, real and brutal answer. But you realize when you speak to most people who espouse those things that they've never actually visited the Eastern Bloc. But I'm glad to say that the ability as a musician to be able to be taken to those places is one of the greatest thrills and the greatest privileges. To be able to walk down a street with a local and have them say, well, you know, when you're in Timișoara, and they go, well, here is where the revolution started, here's where people gathered, here is one flashpoint and another. And the great hope is that the band continues, that you can keep adding countries as you go. And hear their stories and discover more about their past. And this particular, it was only a weekend, but 22 years ago, I think was one of the most, it was a very pivotal event in the history of the band. It was where, you know, we'd been on tour in Europe, we'd been to Portugal and Spain and Germany and Italy and Holland and Belgium, but it was one of the first times where we'd been just that little bit further, and it really expanded our horizons. And my friends, that is episode 129 of Agitators Anonymous. I'm going to have to cut my rambling short because I've got to go and get a plane to the exact same places I'm talking about. And if you're listening to this in those places, well, I'll see you at the bar. And if not, go and visit them. My friends, Agitators Anonymous, episode 129, over and out. I'm Alan Averill.